Hi, and welcome all to this very first panel ever on Metamodernism at AAR. My name is Sissel Undheim, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be presider for this very special roundtable that we have today. And I might sometimes end up saying tonight because I'm speaking from Norway, and so there is a little time difference. So don't be confused if I keep referring to tonight. I will start briefly introducing the session with an excerpt from our original roundtable proposal before I give some practical information about the speakers and the time that we have at our disposal today. And I hope that is okay. So, postmodernism's death throes, arguably commencing in the 1990s, ushered in a robust scholarly inquiry. What comes next? Acknowledging the inevitability of epistemic overlap, in a 2012 JAR essay, Graham Ward wrote, quote, "It is far too premature to announce the demise of the postmodern condition, while two of the primary forces behind that condition, the rise of neoliberal economics and the liquid realities of information, morph into ever new guises. And yet," he concludes, "we are elsewhere." In the study of religion, scholars cannot escape engaging the tensions between modernist universalisms and postmodern hermeneutical interventions like deconstructionism and relativism, even as we sense that this particular bifurcation may hamper our efforts to understand the complexities inherent in our subjects. Fortuitously, multiple ideas have been proffered recently that attempt to theorize the character, guiding discourses, and sensibilities of the postmodern era or milieu. In short, to account for what sort of elsewhere we are dealing with. The means of accounting for this shift that has garnered the most scholarly attention and consideration to date is metamodernism. While metamodern theorization has thus far been purviewed of our colleagues in literary, art, and cultural studies, a handful of scholars of religion entering the discussion in the last decade have built upon these foundations, or in some cases forged new ones, proving vital for contextualizing the religious, spiritual, ontological, and cultural phenomena of current moment. This roundtable today convenes the early explorers of metamodernism in religion and adjacent fields. Our panelists draw from subfields of Asian religion, theology, literature, art history, and popular culture studies. Each of our participants, in unique ways, promote a turn toward humble, emancipatory knowledge that recognizes the existence of multiple modes of the real. So we begin with an audience-friendly introduction to the history or development of metamodern theory or theories. Participants then share a robust range of applications of the term from the aesthetic to the ontological, with attention to their significance for scholarly practice in the humanities. For many of the panelists, their engagement springboards from a definition of the term that has coalesced as comparative and descriptive, as part periodization and part cultural sensibility, and reflects global realities that, quote, compel us to move away from dichotomies like inside, outside, native, alien, self, other, straight, gay, citizen, foreigner. Metamodern sensibilities influencing the tenor of religion scholarship already are seen in recent AAR panels focusing on sincerity, earnestness, affect, and other innovative approaches that think beyond either or limits. Yet, the panel intentionally includes theorists who support divergent usages of the term, with the hope of engaging discerning and contributive dialogue for this rapidly growing field. We are unfortunately missing a couple of voices today, and I would just like to mention them, and they should have been here. Michelle Clasping Johnson was unable to attend. He wrote one of the first essays whose purpose was to evaluate the theoretical efficacy of the term for religious studies in 2017. Ashley Contas is a University of Houston writing instructor who wrote her master thesis at UT Tyler in English literature in 2017, discussing David Foster Wallace, Jonathan Safran Foer, and Sadie Smith as metamodern writers. Ashley also writes on contemporary Judaism. Also, Moyo Okediji, professor of art and art history at the University of Texas, Austin, could not participate today. He was the first curator of African and Oceanic art at the Denver Art Museum and first director of the Center for the Art of Africa and its Diasporas at the University of Texas, Austin. His books include African Renaissance, The Shattered Gourd, and Western Frontiers of African Art. Okediji was one of the first scholars in any field to use the term metamodernism, and his work has influenced some of today's panelists. And as his work has influenced some of today's panelists, we hope this roundtable will spread awareness of his work and influence future theorizations. There is a live transcription, I see. I don't know if it works, but it might look very strange because I know I have a little accent. So I hope it's not too strange. So the practicalities. Each of the presenters today will have 15 minutes, except our first one, Linda Ceriello, who will give a more general introduction in addition to a presentation of her work. And I will post the order of our speakers in the chat now so that you can see how we have planned to spend the time. No. No. Okay, I will do that. But first, let me introduce our first speaker, Linda Ceriello, who received her PhD in 2018 in religion from Rice University. She has been writing and presenting at academic conferences on metamodernism since 2013, including 3 papers on metamodernism at the AAR annual meetings in 2015, 2016, and 2017. She is co-founder and editor of the web journal, What is Metamodern? And also hosts a YouTube video series, What is Metamodern Conversations? She's currently working on a book proposal from her dissertation that brings together research in the areas of contemporary secular spiritualities, Asian religions in the West, narratives of mysticism and monsters, and metamodern theory. She serves on the steering committee for the Religion and Popular Culture unit of the AAR. Linda will give a short orientation to the topic of metamodernism in academia for the audience, followed by a short summary of her own research. So, please, Linda.
Thank you so much, Sissel, for the introduction. And let me share screen with you. Is that showing up? Okay, great. I want to say first that it's very exciting indeed to convene this roundtable, and we're really thankful that the Comparative Studies unit took a chance on it. Obviously, everyone here thinks that metamodernism has value for the comparative study of religion, as we've used it to study cultural artifacts and phenomena that fall in our purview as scholars. So as Sissel mentioned, my first task will be to give a general orientation to the academic research in metamodernism, including briefly and broadly giving a sense of the conceptual waters we're all swimming in. This will hopefully orient and then also highlight some of the variations in its conceptualization. And because time permits only broad brushstrokes here, I'm relying on my fellow panelists to help fill in the details with examples from their own work, or as it may be, to offer their refutations to what I'm about to tell you. In any case, first a little Metamodernism 101 for a framework, and finally, hopefully for evaluating Metamodernism's efficacy for religious studies and the humanities. We hope we will get some discussion going toward the end. So let us begin. So, first generalization to make for you today is that most of us here arrived and or discovered the term metamodernism while trying to answer somewhat similar questions. Broadly, the questions are simple but not at all easy to answer ones. They are what comes after postmodernism and why, as has been increasingly opined since about the turn of the millennium, does postmodernism no longer satisfactorily characterize the current moment in the West? Most of us here latched onto the term metamodern or metamodernism because it has allowed us to look at our subject matter through a lens that helps explain cultural artifacts that don't appear to obey the same sensibilities or rules as before, that aren't explainable using the tropes and discourses of postmodernism. So searching for some way of accounting for these new aesthetic sensibilities that we could feel were probably post. So the vast majority of us here are contributing to kind of a co-inquiry that follows a general sense, as you see on the slide, of placing metamodernism as part of a rough epistemic schema familiar to all of us, the pre-modern to the modern, postmodern and post-postmodern, or offering here metamodernism as a descriptor for this current, what some would call episteme. I put some provisional description to the term here. It's not familiar to everyone. Some dislike the term episteme for valid reasons, I'm sure, but it's one which wraps these other vague category terms that are tossed out, such as period or era or paradigm, and also includes the finer pointed cultural or aesthetic sensibility and or structure of feeling. So this first bit here is to sort out what ballpark this term metamodernism is meant to place us in. And again, not everyone employing it in the same manner, but generally locating it here does mean it's to be taken as a thing on sort of parallel in a category with these other isms. And then we can get to sorting out what sorts of work it can do for us. So this is the basic project for most metamodernism scholars, as I say, asking if something has presented itself in a broad cultural sense as a more apt descriptor than postmodernism, which comes with its laundry list of objectionable or tiresome qualities, including the always already ironic distancing, the impasse created by suspicion toward grand narratives. Forgive me for oversimplifying about postmodernism here. There's obviously a lot more that can be said, not to mention more studied scholars of it than I at our table. But anyway, if there is another descriptor for this current moment, what is it? What are its characteristics? And where do we find this exemplified? So just to be clear, a side note, I'm not aware of any scholars of metamodernism who take it as a wholesale replacement of postmodernism. That's actually beside the point, as we will learn, even if it were possible. Christian Muraru is one who characterizes postmodernism as a resilient specter and its death as an incomplete departure, complete with extemporaneous returns. That's from an American Book Review special edition on metamodernism. But a major tenet of metamodernism is that it signals an engagement of the tenets of each of the epistemes, an awareness that the contemporary subject now lives multiply within and among them. So with that felt reality in mind, the effort becomes not so much to declare a new winner, but to show the either or binary approach itself to be wanting, or to be at least ineffective at describing the felt sense of our current condition. So back to the question of where one finds evidence of metamodernism, the same as in postmodernism, modernism before it, we look to the arts, we look to literature, music, popular culture, vernacular culture, comedy, slang, fashion, product marketing, and styles or modalities of scholarship, some of which we'll be talking about today. So these slides are here. I recognize that it's very hard to get a picture without some concrete examples. So on 2 slides, I've put a small smattering of the cultural products or phenomena, some of which may be recognizable to some of you, maybe. And these are ones to which a metamodern lens has been applied for analysis. So what we feel makes them belong to a grouping called metamodern is something I think each one of us will be addressing in our presentations. But I'll just add a quick slide here just to give a bit of specificity as, oops, that went backwards. There we go. As to what we mean by metamodern qualities. So again, I want to highlight this engagement of the apparent contradictions in some of these epistemes. So for example, earnestness versus irony, seekership versus skepticism. These are things that metamodernism plays very nicely with all, plays well with others. So let me continue on. There's much, much more to say about this aspect of our of aesthetic sensibilities. Sorry, I've got to get myself to the proper place here. Sometimes the arrows work to go forward and sometimes they don't seem to. Okay, so I'd like to move along to a timeline. And what I've done here, my goal is basically to show the chronological usage of metamodernism in academic works. So the top or orange timeline is academic works across the humanities. And for our purposes today, I've located the works in religious studies on a separate vector on the green one below, just to highlight the progress within our field proper. And a quick word about my criteria for this timeline. I've included peer-reviewed articles, book chapters in academic edited volumes, monographs, theses, dissertations, also academic conferences. And I do include a small selection of non-juried works if they have been particularly influential to the development of academic discourses on metamodernism, and or if they happen to come from some of our panelists today. So apologies that I won't have time to linger long enough for you to read this thoroughly, but I can make the presentation available. So brief background as we fall on our first decade here. The early decades metamodernism's genealogy and its earliest ideological underpinnings are located by some as stemming with Masoud Zavarzadeh, who as early as 1975, as you see, used the word metamodernism in this essay. E is for essay. While some read Zavarzadeh's essay as outlining a postmodern literary move, some do feel that the ground is nonetheless laid there for a later shift more closely resembling literary metamodernism. And in 1999, Moyo Okadiji, who was meant to be on our panel today and very sadly was feeling ill, wrote this essay in which he uses the term to offer a theoretical alternative to the strictures of modernism and the passiveness of postmodernism. Apparently, slight correction. He says he began working with metamodernity as a term in 1999 in a different publication entitled Returnee Recollections, Transatlantic Transformations. And then in the following year, he applied the term to this essay in front of you here. And I will mention Moyo's work again a little bit later as it intersects with my own, and I think others may discuss him. But let's move along now to the decade of the 2000s. Things are picking up a little bit here. The major theorist, significant figure, is going to be Alexandra Dumitrescu. She is Romanian, living in New Zealand, and another early theorizer of metamodernism as a literary modality. And now in 2010, this is a very, very busy decade, 2010s. You can see here that there were 610 returns on Google Scholar. Those are separate artifacts engaging metamodernism that does not include citations. So this is obviously a very, very truncated selection here. And I just wanted to focus for our purposes today on a few things. In terms of essays and book chapters, you'll see that the first essay there, 2010, Notes on Metamodernism, written by Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van Denneker. This is far and away the most cited essay, the one that sort of puts metamodernism on the map, academically speaking. It's translated into several languages, and as you can see, cited by a lot of people. So, and we'll talk about some of the ideas in that text just a little bit here. Meanwhile, into the 2020s in progress, already 350 returns on Google Scholar to date, and symposia and conferences, including the one we're in now, that'll be mentioned on the other timeline, but several things planned, monographs, etc. So I just want to try to give a glimpse of the early and major theorists for those who are new to the term, and the array of academic fields at work theorizing it. So now we'll go to specifically to religious studies here, where we find in 1991, this is the first piece of work that I personally have found by a fellow from, let's see, Canadian University, Concordia. Where he's really engaging the sort of sensibility of the New Age and sort of almost prefiguring how neo-capitalism meets later iterations like the spiritual but not religious. So it was interesting for me for my work. And that early essay from 1996 is mentioned in this essay, which does appear in JAR. So I think this is the first mention of the word metamodernism, even though it's a reference to an earlier essay, but the first mention in JAR. And again, similarly, the 2010s, the pace picks up. You'll see many of the names on our panel today are the writers here. Just give you a moment to look at that. And then 2020s, in progress, we have the first monograph by our panelist, Jason Josephson-Storm, and a forthcoming special issue will be published next year. Others that, as I said, I'll share this presentation with those who'd like to get a better and longer look at it. And meantime, let's go to another schema that I've created to try to show some of the major usages in academic treatments. So just a note, of course, this is a structure, certainly not the only way to group and account for these different usages. The cultural and aesthetic shift is the largest bubble you see there, because my guess is around 90% of the academic work in metamodernism to date is building from the supposition that, again, that there is a shift and it's showing up in cultural forms that we want to try to account for, and also that it's descriptive work largely that's being done, and B, that this postmodern shift is an evidence around us and arguably continues to develop. That means that metamodernism, unlike the other umbrella terms in this category of epistemes, modernism, postmodernism, they weren't able to act with quite as quick, of an analysis. mostly we're looking back in time, but now that we are much more self-reflexive people, we're actually describing what we see as we encounter it. And then we are cataloging it and evaluating it as it's happening in real time. So let's just zoom in now to take a bit of a closer look here. The quote you see here is the single most quoted passage in metamodern scholarship. It's from the essay that I pointed to by Vermeulen and van den Akker. And one point I think needs to be addressed, which is oscillation. It's also one of the more misunderstood aspects, I think, by some. The notion is really it's really central, at least for some thinkers, to metamodernism because it's specific to moving between sensibilities evocative of modernism and postmodernism. As you read here, a desire for sense, a doubt about the sense of it all, between sincerity and irony, not meant to be taken as embracing any two pairs of things out there, because it is meant to describe this contemporary condition that I'm trying to speak of, in which the felt reality is of straddling epistemic positions, that it's no longer possible to just assume a truth claim, and it's also not possible to dismiss all truth claims as if just, that dismissal somehow wipes them off the table. So again, it's this felt reality of being between these epistemic positions that is, of course, very significant for us here in religious studies. And also, just to also point out that in this descriptive sense that it's being applied, the metamodern sensibility is not characterized by synthesis, harmony, reconciliation. At least in the conception of Vermeulen and van den Akker, oscillation is not that, precisely because it's a provisionality. It's not a permanent landing, but that instability is pointed to. And here I don't find this as connecting to nihilism or an existential stuckness, but rather it's almost celebrating this human condition of perplexity and betweenness, and the flaws and foibles and the sort of raw reaction to those things that's inherent in the human condition. And in terms of periodization, this is something that for many scholars works hand in hand with that aesthetic and cultural sensibility, that descriptive work. Why is oscillation descriptive of the current condition? Well, some metamodern scholars will offer their causal suggestions to link those two, sometimes linking to socioeconomics and neo-capitalism, sometimes relating to the felt weariness with the aesthetic strictures of constructionism. Or just to give a quick example from my own work, I relate this oscillation as a condition that is experienced and felt to two things: to the economy of likes in our socially mediatized world, and also to tracking of the assimilation of Asian religious and philosophical concepts and ideas in the West, from the demise of the New Age through to the current spiritualities, like the spiritual but not religious, and supporting the turn to some metamodern sensibilities, which I'll hopefully go into a little bit more shortly. Sort of blazing through the rest of these utilizations here. Speaking of periodization and it concerns with it, coeval with the Vermeulen and van den Akker group in the early 2010s, there was another group of scholars in literary studies that conceived of metamodernism as a revival of modernist literature. And there began a robust conversation between them. And this was actually the theme of a 2019 European Conference on Metamodernism. And particularly some earlier usages of metamodernism, and also some very recent ones, have proposed the term to allow them to put certain unwieldy postmodern presumptions of relativism out to pasture, as it were, making space for more responsiveness to actual human and social concerns. A good place, this is a good place to read from a statement by Moyo Okadiji, who again could not be here. He wrote that my interest in metamodernism comes from wearing a Black body and the indifference of postmodernism, highlighting the inadequacy of postcolonial theory for handling the experience of my body as a person, father, artist, scholar, teacher, and curator. And he writes, I prayed in the last decade of the 90s for postmodernity to give way to metamodernism, for the postmodern lack of concern for the matter of my Black body to succumb to a metamodern care for this unrecognized body. The visual cultural theory of metamodernity, for me, both ethically and aesthetically, rests on the iconic image of the last 8 seconds of Floyd's life, George Floyd, an icon that went viral on social media, reaching virtually every village in the entire world with a cell phone. It confirms that one of the most important elements of metamodern visual culture is recognition. It can be read as recognition also. And also some of us work with theological usages of metamodern, which can be treated descriptively, but also prescriptively, reflecting perhaps a need for understanding the reference points of contemporary churchgoers, for example. And as part of this shift, recognizing those new reference points, calling for reevaluation of practices. And I would actually include some contemporary Buddhisms in this grouping as well. Sixth of our usages on this chart is the metacritical innovations for religious studies and for the wider humanities. This quote from one of our panel members who again could not make it, one of the first essays to theorize metamodernism for religious studies. And this is an abiding interest of mine in this area, and also I'm pretty sure that Jason will be talking in this area quite a bit as well. So I'm gonna brush past it now and hope to have a little bit of time to fill in a few details if I have time later. Let's finish up our schema here though with the final loose category. And of course I may have missed some categories. It's quite likely I have, but this one is those who are using the term metamodernism with a specific project in mind, often finding some aspect of the aesthetic sensibility to be appealing, maybe finding the term metamodernism to be appealing. Lots of examples of this going on outside of academia, for sure. Okay, so let me now go on to quick section on my own work. So I have a few slides from some of my book chapters, and I'll just go a little bit into some of the key ideas. This chapter on the spiritual but not religious came from noticing an uptick in narratives of mystical and non-ordinary experience coming both from ordinary people and sometimes celebrities sharing their experiences quite a lot, quite publicly, and also pop culture, TV and film themes. By one estimate a few years ago, about 1/3 of all content on TV that was showing up has supernatural, paranormal, and mystical themes. And I just found that increasingly in secular spaces, it seems like there's this new level of comfort with being publicly spiritual. So I wanted to address that and address the transition from the New Age to the spiritual but not religious, where many of the same beliefs and practices live on, even if no one wants to identify as New Age anymore, by and large. So I thought that the fact that no one had yet extended their readings of these new spiritualities past the post-postmodern era in a way that went forward in time enough to account for the current phenomenon, for example, of the SBNR, made it exciting for me to look at and to find that metamodernism was being theorized really right alongside the instantiation of the spiritual but not religious. It was really interesting. So in that chapter, I also observe what I call a metamodernization of spiritual figures that can be spotted, for example, in Western Neo-Advaita teachers who've recently integrated into their teachings what I think of as metamodern tropes, such as fun and simplicity, lighthearted innocence, all of these in a kind of earnestly ironic, self-reflexive, performed kind of sense. But also, nevertheless, that finding this appropriation amounts to a shift to a more world-affirming and possibly pluralistic perspective. Also, on a more phenomenological level, I was working with the component of the mystical encounter, sometimes calling it the second-hand mysticism, in which there's a period of negotiation. So for the mystic, that negotiation is straddling multiple perceptual realities, cognizant of and perhaps standing in, inhabiting a liminal state, but also experiencing what we could call or even performing a kind of fluidity of identities. So I'm making an analogy or leap to suggest that a secondhand encounter with mystical material, for example, via popular culture, may set up a similar kind of ontological negotiation where the drawing and erasing of boundaries is an active dialectic, a performative process, and relating that to metamodern oscillation. So where Vermeulen and Van den Ecker use the term oscillate as sort of a pendulum that moves between maybe other poles, not just two poles, but other pairs of poles, the notion I build on is that the active riding of these tensions between secular and spiritual and these very public ontologies being performatively generated is how the spiritual but not religious and the nuns forge their identities. They're both inside and outside their secular and spiritual identities, negotiating with these realities in a way analogous to the mystic. And just to connect this briefly with Moyo Okadiji's work, he wrote that an important element of metamodern visual culture is recognition. He also has another term for that, semiotics. And he was linking the Black Atlantic practice of spiritual possession with performative practices as one example of his subject. And he wrote that a contemporary artist can be, in a sense, diasporating across multiple selves, rendering irrelevant modernist structures of racial identity. So as he wrote, metamodern art provides a means to recognize frameworks of justice, equity, and love. So I won't spend as much time on the other chapters. That one, there's a fair amount of building concepts one upon the other. In the chapter that I wrote in Holy Monsters, Sacred Grotesques, I theorized a metamodern monstrous, building in part from the work of Victoria Nelson and others who've pointed to the fact that the more standard frame of a polarity of monstrosity versus humanity is being scripted quite differently. So I used Buffy the Vampire Slayer as, first of all, as my narrative exemplar of this affectively felt reality of radically shifting roles, shifting viewpoints, monster becoming subject instead of just object, even protagonist, similar to the flipping of human protagonists into monsters, and exemplifying a metamodern fluidity of identity narratives that's become more common and more commonplace. And another thing that I do in there is discuss how the show interweaves mystical experiences in a secular setting, portraying them as both personally and socially meaningful, without losing the overall irreverence and ambivalence toward religion. So thus enabling a both-and view of the non-ordinary. And lastly, my conception of a metamodern soteriology comes into play, in which it's a way of describing the emphasis on immanence and this worldliness that I feel has informed current secular spiritualities. So it's a soteriology that hinges on acknowledgement, again, of the flawed, sometimes shadowy, muddied, haphazard, and paradox-driven individual subjectivities, very human, very fractured, but as a salvific principle. So not necessarily replacing the otherworldly transcendent, but declaring that the transcendent is no longer so much of an endpoint, and yet neither is the sacred disenchanted or deconstructed away. And in this chapter, which I wrote with Greg Dember, this is giving a concrete example again of the application of qualities of metamodern aesthetic sensibilities to a particular cultural product to show whether metamodern horror can bring us forward out of postmodernism's reliance on sort of self-mocking, reflexive intertextuality, which I believe that it does, and it does very innovatively. And finally, to just a little bit about my dissertation, where some of the concepts I just explained are explored in more depth. And additionally, I look at whether metamodernism might be a better term for what some call postmodern Christianity and or Buddhist postmodernism, whether in some cases some of the people theorizing in the 2000s especially are pointing at what could properly be called metamodern phenomena in the changes in the church or in the practices, but they just didn't have a word for it yet. So again, I'm theorizing about how a reader or a viewer of mystical narratives may enter into a certain level of participation, and that dovetails into what we're seeing, I think, in the academy already in religious studies, in terms of what metamodern scholarship might look like. So can I get a check on how much time I might have left? None? I'm seeing none. Okay. If we do get a chance later in the Q&A, I have a lot of examples from the AAR in the last couple of years of where I've been seeing metamodernism showing up in scholarship. It's been really interesting, exciting to see. Not using the term metamodern, but describing things that follow suit very nicely. Anyway, perhaps that will get a chance to come up if it's of interest. I will stop my screen share now, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and we do look forward to your book. There's no time, unfortunately, now for questions, but we have left ample time for questions and comments after all the presentations. So please save all the thoughts and questions that you might have until after. There is, of course, I think we should at least applaud, even though we move on. So just thank you. And our next speaker is Tom DeBrain, who has spent the last 5 years researching metamodernist sensibilities in the context of the worldwide and the European Seventh-day Adventist Church. This church is specifically interesting for metamodernist engagement as its foundation and dominant theologies are explicitly modernists. Whereas the Brain notes that members increasingly espouse postmodernist points of view. The Brain has presented, published, and blogged his metamodernist analysis of current sociological trends and theological thinking in several languages, including That's So Meta, the Postmodern Church, in Adventist Today in 2015. He will discuss this analysis of Adventist theology from a metamodern point of view, highlighting the current trends in the Adventist Church.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see my screen. If I can have a thumbs up. Yes, great. So a couple of disclaimers here. I'm a stranger in a strange land in the AAR because I'm not a scholar of religion, but rather of the Bible. I should be at the SBL. I focus on receptions of and interactions with the Bible in popular culture. And besides that, I've worked as a youth worker for many years in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is where we see an overlap between my two interests that get me ended up here. From that point of view, I want to look at two recentish films today and look at how they show metamodern sensibilities, so we can get a bit of a feel for what Linda has been talking about. And I want to look at how they engage with Christianity, theology, and the Bible. The first will be the final film in the Hunger Games series, and the second will be a brief look at a scene from Hail Caesar. We just had a lot of theory from Linda about metamodernist things, and just to put it into context, what I'll be looking at is this concept of oscillation, so jumping between sincerity on the one hand and irony on the other, and this concept of informed naivety, aka believing in something that you know can't be true. So keep those two in mind during the discussion that I will present. So the Hunger Games were originally written as a trilogy of novels. Now there are 4 for young adults. In 2012 to 2015, they were adapted into a series of hugely popular blockbusters. In these movies, Katniss fights against the dystopian rulers of the world. Ultimately, she wins and creates a new society, which we would expect to be utopic, a new utopia. In the final film, called Mockingjay Part 2, we see the climactic victory of protagonist Katniss, seen here, and the rebels over President Snow and the ruling elite. The premise of the series is that every year, 2 young people from each district in the country are sent to battle for life and death, the Hunger Games, and only one victor emerges. In other words, 23 children die. This reimagining of a Roman circus is meant for entertainment. With the promises of a lifetime of victory for the victor, it enforces the subjugation of the people. The plot is complicated and convoluted, expressly slow, and we're not really interested about that. We're interested in what's coming up next. Katniss eventually leads the rebels' attack on the capital. They beat their oppressors, but in the attack, most of Katniss's team die. She makes it to the mansion, and on arriving, she sees a plan dropping what appear to be food parcels on the people. There are, in fact, bombs. Now, this is a horrific event, and it turns out that it wasn't the evil overlords that did this, but the rebels themselves that did this bombing. In other words, Katniss's team. For them, the end justifies the means, and the true nature of the rebels, led by the new President Coin, becomes apparent when they institute a new set of Hunger Games with the children of the old elite fighting for survival. Now, Katniss sees this and realizes that the new rule that she fought for is equally bad as the old one. And when she is meant to execute the old President Snow, she turns around and kills the new one, hoping against hope that not a second but a third rebellion will persevere and preserve the possibility for a fair government. Now, after all this, the new ruler, who we hope is better than the first 2, reflects on this, and he says, now we are in that sweet period where everyone agrees that our recent horror should never be repeated. But collective thinking is usually short-lived. We're fickle, stupid beings with poor memories and a great gift for self-destruction. Although who knows, maybe this will be it, Katniss, the time it sticks. Maybe we are witnessing the evolution of the human race. Think about that. So Katniss and the rebels might have won, but it seems like they've replaced one dystopia with the next. Coin, the second president, was no better and no worse than the first one. And even when Katniss wins again, destroying the short-lived Coin regime, a new promise of utopia is immediately rendered short-lived. But at the same time, there is this desire, hopeless as it may be, a desire that this time it would be true. This time we will finally have that permanent utopia. Now, whether or not the utopia lasts, Katniss experiences the founding of it. She lives in that utopia, and this is where we get to the final utopic scene of the movie and the series, which we'll watch together.
Oh, have nightmares too. Someday I'll explain it to you. Why they came. Why they won't ever go away. But I'll tell you how I survive it. I make a list in my head of all the good things I've seen someone do. Every little thing I can remember. It's like a game. I do it over and over. It gets a little tedious after all these years, but there are much worse games to play.
Then we get the Hunger Games as the final words. So there are worse games to play. Katniss, living in this long-awaited utopia, is hopelessly scarred by the past. She lives in the utopia she dreamt and fought for all her life, but that utopia does not really exist. Most importantly, the only thing that keeps her going is a repetitive counting game of acts of goodness. She doesn't focus on the big world-changing events. She doesn't focus on the newly formed benevolent government that she helped create. Katniss focuses on the small acts of goodness that she personally experienced. That is her hope in her utopia. So then what is utopia for Katniss? Is it the new world order that she helped create? No, it can't be. Her utopia is only when she remembers the goodness that others did for others. She does not focus on the ideological utopia of fair government and egalitarian society. She scans the world and sees little bits of utopia reflected in the acts of people. So how does this scene reflect a meta-modern sensibility? There are a few things. Firstly, let's talk about tone. This final scene is hyper-idyllic. The yellow cast, the father and child playing in the wheat, the incredibly over-the-top music. It sets the audience up for an extremely sincere reading of this being the ultimate utopia that Katniss fought for. At the same time, there's a tonal dissonance between the images and the words being spoken, as the words themselves are horrific. The oscillation here between sincerity and irony that is so indicative of the metamodern is driven home when Katniss looks directly at the camera. On the one hand, in sincerity, she looks at her partner and child playing in the utopia, but at the same time, it appears as if she's looking at us, as if to say, yeah, right, as if. Now, if we move on to how she actually portrays the utopia, let's think of utopia from a metamodern perspective. The metamodern generation is made up of people like Katniss. They were born into a world that had already been ruined, a world that had been ruined by their parents, by boomers, a world of climate change and economic crisis, a world of governments who can't seem to get their acts together, a world where Europe, the unified nation of hope that we were born into, is starting to fall apart, a world where the hope for multiculturalization or multiculturalism of the 90s has turned into discrimination made possible by terrorism, a world where refugees are not welcome, a world where conservative nationalism is growing, a world where neoliberalism rules freely, creating more inequality and more environmental disaster. This generation was born into a world that has been ruined, and all it has had is hope. Hope for a better future, hope for a utopia, but at the same time, realization that utopias don't exist, that utopias can't resist, that things aren't going to be solved one day. But at the same time, and this is the big thing, utopias remain useful. So let me quote from a foundational article on Metamodernism by Vermeulen and van den Akker. As an impossible possibility, utopia should not be perceived as a new ideological blueprint, however. Much rather, it should be understood as a tool, say, a looking glass, for scanning this world and others for alternative possibilities. A looking glass for scanning this world, not an ideological blueprint. And this is what we saw in the scene I showed. Katniss is not interested in the new fair government. She's not interested in the free society she helped create. She's not interested in the ideological blueprint. It means nothing to her. She is scanning the world, looking for possibilities, looking, in her case, for small acts of goodness. Now, this resonates strongly with what I've been seeing going on in Seventh-day Adventist circles and the way young Adventists relate to the idea of heaven, which is ultimately a utopia. From an Adventist point of view, heaven is this perfect place, a place without pain or sadness. Heaven is the hope for which many Adventists live. Yet increasingly it seems that young people are disillusioned with this portrayal of Christian hope. Many youngsters that I've spoken to have no desire to be part of heaven. And many have told me that the emphasis on heaven, they think, counteracts the idea of Christianity itself. At the same time, many young people worldwide are calling the church to stop wasting time, to stop talking about details, be those theological or other, and focus on helping those who need help, helping the needy. Young people are calling out to hit the streets and do something, anything that could be that could help. And theologically, then, the Adventist church has this utopia, a never-ending theocratical kingdom of love and equality. And a metamodernist can accept and love that utopia. But it is impossible. It is an impossible possibility, the hope in something that will never be. In the meantime, or at the same time, you can use the kingdom as a mirror of the world. And I think that is what is resonating with the young people in the Adventist church. In my church context, an event called Global Youth Day thrives, a day where the youth leave the churches and go, what they do is live the sermon. They don't go to church to listen, but they go out on the streets to help. And this version of utopia, using heaven as a looking glass, but scanning the world and others for alternative possibilities, seems to be much more interesting to this metamodern generation. Now, this example from popular culture was less obviously about Christianity. I tried to link it to my experience in the churches. My second example, which is much, much shorter, is very clearly a reception of the Christian Bible. It's from a 2016 film called Hail Caesar, and the plot is unimportant here, but the scene I'm showing you is where they are filming a crucifixion scene for a Jesus movie that they're making. And as we watch it together, keep in mind that idea of oscillation between sincerity and irony. And as we watch it, keep the library of crucifixion scenes from films that you may have in the back of your mind. Maybe you can think of some hyper-sincere ones like The Greatest Story Ever Told or Mel Gibson's The Passion, or maybe an extremely ironic one like Monty Python's Life of Brian, where they all sing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life" and whistle together. Afterwards, I won't be saying anything about this, but hopefully it'll give us some good food for discussion afterwards.
Before this Hebrew, Autolycus?
I encountered him before, Gracchus. Beside the well of Jehoshaphat. And what manner of man?
He's a priest of the Israelites, despised even by the other priests.
No. On yesterday's march, punished by the dust of the road, I sought to drink first at the well, before the slaves in my charge, whose thirst was far greater than my own.
A Roman drinks before a slave.
This man was giving water to all. He saw no Roman, he saw no slave. He saw only men, weak men, and gave succor. He saw suffering, which he sought to ease. He saw sin and gave love.
Love, Autolycus?
He saw my own sin, Gracchus, and greed. But in his eyes I saw no shadow of reproach. I saw only light. The light of God.
You mean of the gods?
I do not, friend Gracchus. This Hebrew is the son of the one God, the God of this far-flung tribe. Why shouldn't God's anointed appear here, among these strange people, to shoulder their sins? Here, Gracchus, in this sun-drenched land. Why should he not take this form, the form of an ordinary man? A man bringing us not the old truths, but a new one.
A new truth.
A truth beyond the truth that we can see. A truth beyond this world. A truth told not in words, but in light. A truth that we could see if we had but... If we had but...
Acad! Faith! Have but faith!
Faith. Faith! Faith!
God damn!
Go on again. Isn't it...
They changed it.
Got most of them, man. All right.
All right, hang on.
Hang it, pad down. I'm sweating like a pig in this thing.
Son of a bitch.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can give a little round of applause. And as you said, I hope we'll save questions for the Q&A so that we can follow up also here. Our next speaker now is Jason Ananda Josephson Storm, Professor of Religion and Chair of Science and Technology Studies at Williams College. He received his PhD from Stanford University, his MA from Harvard University, and has held visiting positions at Princeton University, École Française d'Extrême-Orient, and Universität Leipzig in Germany. Storm is the author of award-winning The Invention of Religion in Japan from 2012, The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of the Human Sciences from 2017, as well as Metamodernism, The Future of Theory from 2021, all published by University of Chicago Press. So please, Jason.
Thanks. It is a pleasure to be in front of you and able to talk today. It's also, I want to thank Linda especially for organizing this. This has been really lovely and it's a great chance to put our heads together. And I want to thank the Comparative Studies and Religion Unit. What I'm going to be talking about today, is I'm going to gesture a little at my book. I'm in a basement, so ignore the background sounds. I'm going to gesture a little at my book and give you a quick overview and highlights. And then I'm going to gesture at the implications, especially the book's process social ontology for comparative religion and for theorizing the metamodern. So I'm going to try and make it more useful, even though in many respects I'm the heretic. I'm the odd person out in this group in the way that the category metamodern is being used. And you're welcome and encouraged to tweet at least my presentation for those of you who do such things. So to kick us off, timer begins. Okay. Many folks have used the term metamodernity as a period, a zeitgeist, a grand episteme, or a structure, a feeling. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not trying to identify aspects of culture as metamodern, although I think if you are, my theory could help. And I'm particularly skeptical of accounts of oscillation for their reasons of falling into the no true Scotsman fallacy, etc. I don't think metamodern is worse as a periodization than others. I have my issues with postmodernity as a periodization, which first appeared in 1917 and was declared dead in 1975 before becoming a dominant academic category in the American Academy in the 80s and 90s. So, for reasons, there's a quote from me about why I think partially postmodernism is a mess, but I'll save that and we can talk about it a little bit later. What I'm trying to do instead is metamodernism as a project. I'm inspired by things like Turner's Metamodernist Manifesto, but centrally, Moya Okadiji, in a little piece of his early writings in Transatlantic Dialogues, Contemporary Art in Africa, he said, metamodern artists willfully transcend, fracture, subvert, and I can only see part of my screen, disrupt, hijack, and appropriate modernity and postmodernity and early ever opportunity. The metamodern is an extension of and challenge to modernism and postmodernism. So in a way, that's actually what I'm trying to do, is to articulate these kind of challenges. And to give you something a little bit more specific, what I'm going to do is depart from the notion of postmodernism. Postmodernism has, among other things, been used to describe a particular scholarly paradigm. And I'm trying to be very specific about what I mean. And I am to dialectically work through postmodernism and modernism alike as paradigms to try and come up with a new way to do scholarship that recoups the best of both preceding movements while canceling out their various impasses. From my perspective, the meta prefix, which could just be a synonym for post, right? If you look at the Greek and the Latin, meta and post only diverge at a certain point. In my case, the meta prefix is thus primarily to suggest a higher or second order position beyond postmodernism. Put differently, the main emphasis in my use of metamodernism is on this meta, not on the modernism. That said, in my book, I don't presume that the reader care at all about the meaning of the word postmodernism or the word metamodernism, except as springboards for serious theorizing. The book is itself an exercise in first order philosophy that I think should stand on its own. I'm not describing a metamodern paradigm, but aiming to trigger one. Although those of you in this panel are happy, I'm happy to have you characterize me in different ways as part of the things you're analyzing. So let me talk a little bit more. To give you the structure of the book in the abstract, it has 7 chapters, 4 parts. I've been told that it could have been, maybe should have been 4 different books. At the very least, it does a lot of different things. One way to describe what it's doing in a little more detail is that it takes together, taking a kind of Hegelian negation of the negation. It works through 5 problematics associated with postmodernism, and each dialectically produces something different, which I'll end up calling a kind of metamodern theory. I can't see my whole slide, oops, which is a little bit of a shame, but that's okay. The book is an attempt to provide, in a short word, the language, for example, in a proposal about different modes of the real is something that I'm working toward. But in brief, the book is an attempt to provide an ambitious and systematic reappraisal of the human sciences in 2 areas, a reevaluation of values, and in larger part, it is an attempt to trigger a reorientation to our basic subject matter as scholars across the academy. Recast, it provides an ethics, or at least a goal, an epistemology, and a notion of meaning, and a set of research methods, as well as a novel ontology for studying the social world. And in these last 2 points, which I think are going to be interesting and relevant to anyone trying to do quote unquote comparative religion or trying to formulate a category like that of the metamodern. So I want to, in the spirit of positive conversation, tell you what some of the payoff of that is. And I want to do it first by noting some of the critique and working my way through it. Okay, so comparison, I want to argue, is cognitively basic. You're doing comparison when you're choosing what to put in a fruit salad. Monkeys do comparison where they decide what to eat. Comparison is also a nearly unavoidable byproduct of translation. To translate or choose to reject the translation of Imani as faith already implies a comparison. So we're struck with comparison. So comparison has been critiqued, but generalizations as such are not the primary issue. As Kawasi Wiridu has argued, decolonizing philosophy necessitates unmasking spurious universals, but not all generalizations are false. The issue is not that we generalize, but how. Of course, the broader the generalization we make, i.e. when we're talking about zeitgeist or episteme, the higher the standard of evidence needs to be. The problem with the other thing about comparison is often described in terms of discovering similarity. But that too has problems that maybe haven't been recognized as much. As Watanabe Satoshi argues, everything is similar to everything else. A skull is like the moon in that they're both material objects, vaguely spherical, appear to be the same shade of gray in certain light, and are both referred to in the same Octavio Paz poem. However, it is a mistake to conclude from similarity anything significant about that resemblance. Any arbitrarily determined set of objects is going to share properties in common, but this does not mean they're part of a significant natural grouping or kind. Furthermore, if all members of a given set share a common quality or property, the tertium comparationis, that does not imply that this similarity itself is significant or defining. For instance, to evoke Ludwig Wittgenstein's famous example of games, games are activities, but being an activity is not determinate as it captures more than games. So even if all games are activities, not all activities are games. Hence, games cannot be defined in terms of activities. On a sufficiently high level of abstraction, everything is going to find common denominators, but it's actually comparatively meaningless. It is not sufficient to justify something as a defining feature or essential feature of a given category. Indeed, the common quality of a given set is often the product of presumed assumptions of comparative judgments, not the reverse. comparative judgments also depend on the reasons behind and the purposes and circumstances behind the comparison. Take another example, sorting luggage. If you're sorting luggage at the airport, from a pilot's perspective, bags are more similar the closer they are in weight. From a fashionista's perspective, it might be brands that bags more similar might have the same branding. From a baggage handler's perspective, stacking bags might emphasize similarity in shape. From a passenger, the most similar bags are the ones that he or she owns, etc. Similarity is not an absolute property of a set of objects, nor an innate clustering of qualities. And perceptions of absolute similarity say more about one's perspective, purpose, and perhaps prior linguistic categories than anything else. So faced with two urinals, you probably can't see this because it's in the lower right of the screen, but that's the famous Dadaist urinal, the fountain, is hardly more similar to Da Vinci's La Gioconda than it is to its non-art toilet sibling. That one can see a resemblance between different artworks does not mean that any pair of artworks are more similar than they are to non-art. So judgment of summary task dependence, some people try and solve this with going to Wittgenstein. That doesn't work. I'll tell you why later if you care. Bruce Lincoln has famously defended what he calls weak comparison. I like Lincoln's work in many respects, but weak comparison is weak. He roots weak comparison in a reading of Saussure. Saussure was wrong about différance. I don't know why we're still trying to do philosophical theory based on 100 years old linguistics when linguistics has moved quite a huge distance in that intervening time. But it leads to an important point, which is that difference has equivalent, or my counter argument to this movement is that difference has equivalent problems to similarity. Everything is also different from everything else in some respect. To evoke a Buddhist philosophical observation, even the same person is different at different time slices. For instance, my daughter at birth had a different constituent mass, personality, size, shape, and many other properties than she does today as a 3-year-old. Assessments of difference are no less comparisons and fall victim to the same set of problems around generalizability that plague judgments of similarity. So projects of comparison, strong and weak, suffer from often less than they appear and suffer from the same set of problems. In summary, apparent similarity or difference might be a good starting place for research, but doesn't tell us very much on its own. To observe that something is so does not tell us why it is so, and lacking this, we are limited in the generalizations or knowledge we can produce about a topic. A statement that all red things are red has not contributed much to knowledge. But I want to argue that critiques of comparison are not really about comparison as much as they are about the category religion. And the problem with that category, I have already argued in print, and I'll return to it later, but I also want to suggest for scholars of religion that we came to the party a little bit late. Other categories are equally criticizable. I line up these critiques in this book, but in 1956, Moritz Weitz articulated the problem with art, Dorothy Emmett's Society in 58, Raymond Williams, Culture, Russell Hanson, Science, same year, Walter Ullmann, The Political in 61, Holly Hart, The Law, Cantwell Smith then hits religion finally in 62, but it's the same year we get the Kunin critique of science and Hayden Whitehead's critique of history. As I argue in the book, all of these things have similar kinds of critical, I realize I have not much time, so I won't say much detail about them, but all the critiques are similar, and you can extract from them a set of strategies you could use to deconstruct anything. And I want to say that what we first need to do is grant, not repudiate the critiques. So this is the first radical gesture that we can then use a kind of anti-foundationalism as a kind of new foundation. To do that, I suggest we should embrace a process social ontology. We can embrace many of these critiques if instead of thinking of the world in terms of substances, we think about the social world in terms of processes. There's a long history of thinking of social kinds as natural kinds, as substance instead of processes. But instead of this reification, I think we need to posit, instead of positing homogeneity or stability, we have to start from the ubiquity of diversity, heterogeneity, difference, and change. If we presume change and difference, this flips a Foucauldian genealogy on its head, and instead of unmasking false unities, the thing to be explained is even temporary zones of stability and homogeneity. To do this explaining, articulate a notion of social kinds as these temporary zones of stability. And I define social kinds as socially constructed, dynamic, homeostatic, and heterostatic clusters of properties capacities, which are determined by the causal processes they anchor the relevant clusters. Sorry, I'm going fast. I know that's a little bit dense. You can read in the book a fuller explanation of what those are. I promise you, I'm fully against bullshit theory that throws out terms that don't mean anything or is anywhere unclear, I really try and explain this in the book, but I'm happy to do more in the Q&A. But there are three features of social kinds I want you to keep in mind. Social kinds are best understood as unfolding processes and then thus tend to be highly entropic or varied, both spatially and temporally. And social kinds cross-cut each other so that the same entity can be the intersection of different social kinds. Third, social kinds exceed their reference. So the same word can imply different social kinds and different words can refer to the same kind. So one of the issues we've got to think about in terms of categories like religion or metamodernity is exactly when we're doing kinds of artificial reification maneuvers, when we're talking about cross-cutting, and when we're using the same word to mean very different things. I want to suggest that we can get even more specific if we look at different kinds of anchoring processes. As you can see, this is a slide from an old talk that I went into a lot more detail than I have time for today. But I want to suggest that we can get very specific about the different kinds of things that cause various aspects of our social world to temporally stabilize and make them amenable to description or study. And so from classificatory, anyway, I won't list this. I'm aware of my own limitedness, and I have a tendency to speak too quickly anyway. So instead of reading through this, I want to suggest that what gets a member into a social kind is properties, in other words, what an entity can do, and the causal mechanisms that cause the entity to have those properties in the first place. And these are the different kinds of, broadly speaking, anchoring processes I think about in the book. This means that for comparison to be useful, neither similarity nor difference is sufficient. And we cannot presume the essentialness of our category of analysis. We can't assume that just because we see two things being similar that they're both equally members of the category religion. We need a causal account of why the particular case in question comes to have the relevant cluster of properties. In other words, if we want to produce a kind of knowledge of our subject, and I argue in this book for it, we need to produce a kind of humble knowledge. We have a problem that is analogous to the classical problem in philosophy of a problem of abduction identified by David Hume and others. In other words, what makes a particular concept generalizable? When are we justified in generalizing from one black crow to the generalization that most crows are black? The problem is all the observed crows don't tell us anything about unobserved crows on their own. So for this reason, understanding causes, among other things, is important to the differentiation between weak and strong inductive generalizations. Actually, in the book, I argue we should be doing not inductive, but abductive generalizations, and we should gain extra ground by overcoming alternative hypotheses, but I don't have time to talk about that here. I want to suggest, and I know I've been going very quickly, and there's a lot I can recount. I would love to talk your ears off about it in more detail, but I want to suggest that what I argue in the Metamodernism book has concrete implications, not just for the study of something called metamodernism, but across the academy for how we might do our work. And for instance, I have argued, and you might not be able to see this because of the way that the screen is partially cut off, but I've argued that so-called religions share the properties they do today, not because of being inherently members of the same universal natural kind, but in good part because of classificatory processes and enforcement mechanisms, e.g. the nation state, international treaties, scholarship, etc., that have in effect produced those similarities. And if you want, I wrote a whole book about that. It's called The Invention of Religion in Japan, and you can read it if you'd like. But I think that's both my argument against comparative religion, but my argument for the possibility of a newly reformulated comparative religion once we grant a kind of process-social ontology and deconstruct the category of religion first. Out the other side of that, we can then do, I think, a kind of robust work. Similarly, for the category metamodernism to be useful, it needs to identify not just similarities, but also the purpose of categorizing in the first place, and importantly, the causal anchoring processes that have produced the relevant cluster, if there is such. It is not enough to identify patterns. It's important. I think you're doing great work identifying patterns, but we have to avoid a kind of apophenia. In other words, an artificial projection of patterns on a complex system, or there's a strong tendency, like, I don't know, the first time I read a J.R. Tolkien novel when I was like 10 or something like that, I saw J.R. Tolkien everywhere, right? There's a strong tendency to project an artificial coherence of patterns on a complex system. And we have to be careful that when we're seeing similarities or patterns, there's some meaningful reason that those things are co-occurring. This is, for instance, why I like Fred Jameson's description of postmodernism much more than Lyotard's Condition postmoderne, because I mean, Lyotard actually, anyway, has a bunch of problems, but the Jameson did not. Anyway, I realize I'm running out of time. This presentation may not have been may have been a little glimmer, a few flashes of what I'm trying to do in the book. I hope it has been tantalizing tidbits. There's a lot more there. And I really want to try and figure out how, even though I'm coming from a very different position than many of the rest of you on this panel, I can try and help you in so much as I can to re-theorize the things that you're trying to solve. And there are other points of agreement I didn't emphasize, but I think hopefully our conversation today will bring this out in greater detail. But if any of you have further questions for me, I'm kind of slow on email, but please email me, and you can find me on various social media. I have a blog and Twitter and what have you. Thank you, and thank you for your time. I will stop sharing my screen and stop sharing the sound of my furnace with you. Thank you again for listening and for your time and attention.
Thank you so much for your paper. And we are unfortunately running a bit short on time, so we will move quickly on to our next speaker, Brendan Graham Dempsey, who is a writer whose work focuses on the meaning crisis and the nature of spirituality and metamodernity. He earned his BA in Religious Studies from the University of Vermont and his MA in Religion and the Arts from Yale University. He is the author-editor behind the Metamodern Spirituality book series and the host of the Metamodern Spirituality podcast.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Great. I'm going to try to share my screen, but I don't see the option to do so. So I'm not sure if I was made host, which is all right if I can't, because I can just do it without that.
I think I can make you host if you want.
Oh, that'd be great.
Let me.
Oh yeah, great. Thank you very much. All righty. Right. So, yes, I would say I'm a theorist as well as an artist in this terrain. I'm one way of putting it would be I'm interested in how different epistemas articulate God concepts. In some ways, God here being more of a stand-in general term for issues of ultimate concern, meaning, meta-narrative conceptions of purpose and ultimate reality, etc. And that recognizing that these ideas, these concepts shift through time in different epistemas from traditional to modern to postmodern and into the metamodern, arguably, that's sort of my locus of interest and something that I'm trying to explore theoretically via art or artistically using theory, however you want to think about that. And so my interest is sort of a articulating and expressing and exploring a metamodern God concept, whatever that might be. So here's sort of where theory meets implementation, prescriptive narratives, and things of that nature. So in some ways, this is, adjacent to some of these cultural analyses, using them, and also trying to sort of bring them into cultural production more or less explicitly. So I'm the author of, you're actually probably seeing my notes actually as I'm holding this up. I'll keep that in mind. Well, now you've got a sneak peek on where I'm going. So this is my series that I'm doing, which is Metamodern Spirituality series, currently 5 volumes. I'll be reading from the first one here. And I'm going to talk a little bit. Here, I have an idea. Why don't I pause sharing on my screen? That way I can use my notes and then pop back into this when I need to actually read from it. Great. So the first volume, which I'll be reading from today, it's an epic poem called God. Epic being not a frequent genre one encounters much these days, but something that I see also in its use as being an example of sort of this return or revitalization of revival, I should say, of more typically modern and even pre-modern aesthetic genres. And it takes up sort of the Nietzschean trope of the death of God, specifically, I would say the pre-modern traditional God concept, and in search of a resurrection of a new sense of the sacred, which is trying to, in some ways, identify but express this emerging sensibility, a metamodern spiritual sensibility. So coming after the cultural dominance of modern rationalism and postmodern relativism, it's a God concept that's going to be necessarily embracing these the kind of disillusioning revelations of modernity, as well as the deconstructive awareness brought by postmodernity. And so what that looks like is sort of the question, which is then being explored through aesthetic means. Now, Raoul Escherman, who's a theorist and a professor who's in this domain talking about metamodernism and performatism, talks about the shift to the phenomenological from the epistemological. So one way of putting this is Vermeulen writes, one of the original articulators of the metamodern concept in the Notes on Metamodernism essay. And in a separate article on what he calls depthiness, he refers to a distinction that he noticed between, say, a line from a Radiohead song, which he sees as sort of typifying the kind of postmodern cynicism, which expresses the notion just because you feel it doesn't mean it's there, and contrasts that with a line that he heard in the series Girls, which he sees as typifying the more of a metamodern sensibility, which is just because it's fake doesn't mean I don't feel it. And so if you can kind of think between those two spaces, just because you feel it doesn't mean it's there, versus just because it's fake doesn't mean I don't feel it. There's a shift to the phenomenological and the what Greg Denberg calls the protection of interiority, such that the metamodern spirituality and spiritual sensibility that I'm tracking and also trying to express is located within a kind of aesthetic realm of sensation, feeling, which is sort of aware of its own locus within sensation and art and aesthetics, and doesn't try to deny that. So in some ways, it's aware of the deconstruction and yet is unable to negate that constructed awareness, and so basically owns it. And I see this very tied in with the metamodern notion of informed naivete, which one of our previous presenters mentioned. So with all that, sort of just to set up some of this material, I'm going to do a quick couple of readings, see how many I can fit in, that I think sort of exemplify some of these sensibilities in artistic fashion, and then talk a little bit about it and go from there. So now let me share my screen, just so you can follow along. Can you see my screen? Great. So now I'll just, this way you can see the text that I'm reading from as well. Of course, it's a long poem. I can't set up the entire context here. Suffice it to say, the speaker has gone into the underworld in search of the dead god, and has come back up and has sort of encountered a group of artists who he's trying to kind of bring into his mission to sort of instantiate or implement this sort of reemergent metamodern spiritual sensibility, even as they all recognize that the god is dead. So here's the speaker sort of admonishes these artists for their lack of imagination in advocating the implementation and the expression of new metamodern sensibilities in the face of the death of God. He says, let me just find my spot. So they look at me confused. And so I shout again, "Come on, we have a God now for our cause." "But he is dead," says one. Another, "Dead and buried." To which I wipe my brow of tears and sweat, and with the maddened sense demanded now by this our age, or else the age to come, I sneer back from my scaffold balcony, a tear-stained insolence and helpless hope, and call down, "Dead? The god is dead? Is dead? Well, what is that to us? God damn you all, you are no artists. Weathermen, more like. Accountants, scales and beams. An artist looks on graves and sees a tiller's plot, sees seeds in all the coffins, sleeping soft and dark till harvest time. What, is your canvas flat? Then it too must be dead to more dimensions, cracked brush, cast hurtle-link into the fire, for making plains a portal into depth seems far beyond you. So, the god is dead, and so is false, and so is worthless, yes? For such an end unravels all that was, as gods who die must never then have lived. And yet, we've known his power, life or lifeless, true, false, something or nothingness, a sense that carved the world. His shrines and temples, hymns and rousing anthems broke our souls in two. And out of them drew up an ecstasy so worthy of a god. His tapestries and frescoes, vaults and architraves and beams and colonnades and porticos called out our better sense and made transcendence seem as imminent as bread. Sun set upon the frost, and with its colors overproved the theologian's gloss. All logic's proofs and certainties we long to chain him with. Is that dead too? That soul that lives in veins and goosebumps after head soul has expired? If so, by suicide. If skin, hair, heart rejoiced regardless of a spirit realm, and if in thunderheads we saw some throne and some Elysium, amen, amen, I say to you. Hail dome, hail pantheon, hail oratorio, and hallelujah to the round glass which plays the halo tube, sweet Chartres, Notre Dame. Amen, I say, to holy Parthenon and pagan priests who wooed us with their mumbled prayers. For these savaged the question, true or false, alive or dead, as nothing makes the world to weep, and nothing plays the light, and nothing stirs creation, inbreaks inspiration, spreads its majesty upon a feckless world where nothing moves us, nothing strikes, but all cry out to nothing, be our God and we'll be worth you. So is beauty born, and God to be so empty, yet fill up the world. It maddens definition of our nothing. It gives the lie to truth, makes paradox more worthy of our aim in spirit worship. You know it too. So come, let us not talk of death. God is not dead, but only sleeping, sleeping within our hands, which always are and always have been strong with resurrection. That would be, I think, articulating a couple of the sentiments here that I'm trying to get at. Let me see if I can share my video again. Of basically the kind of willed, or I shouldn't say willed, though that's another element here, but the informed naivete, the assumption of a sort of naive belief, even while that belief is knowingly and entirely deconstructed, and that deconstructed reality isn't sought to be ignored. It's actually intelligently embraced and brought up into the conception of the thing itself. In terms of time, I could read another passage if I've got any. I have two more. I could do one. I'll look for a nod either way. Nope, no time. Okay, so that's a taste anyway. And again, this is a long work, and it exemplifies some of the things that I think, well, many of the things that we're talking about: aesthetically mediated belief, informed naivete, and through an artistic genre that is itself sort of, implied in these sort of modern and pre-modern revivals that are characteristic of some of the neo-romantic sensibilities that are theorized by Vermeulen and Vandenacker, etc. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of this, and hope some of that was intelligible, if not enjoyable. Cheers.
Thank you so much for this. And we are running a little late, but we have one more speaker that was entered quite late because there were other speakers who could not attend. And so I hope you are all okay with the last presentation, which I will be the one to present. If I could ask you, Brendan, to stop sharing your screen. I can still see.
You bet. Well, it says new share. How do I unshare?
Okay, I'll see if I can unshare. Oh,
there we go.
There, thank you. So, as I said, we are running a little late, so I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can. but I was asked to just say a little bit about my work, as I have just very briefly worked on metamodernism myself, and I'm hoping to do more in the future. So this is just a little glimpse of work in progress indeed, and I was also hoping perhaps that the Q&A and the discussion afterwards could point me in further directions. So my name is Sissel Undheim. You can all see my screen, I hope. Now, yeah, my slide, thank you. I'm professor in religious studies at the University of Bergen, Norway, where I work on a range of topics, actually, from religion and gender in antiquity to contemporary religion and popular culture. My two most recent publications may give an impression of my research interests, so I thought I'd mention them. The latest is a book chapter about using Beyoncé's music video Formation to teach religious studies, and this is in Norwegian only. And before that, I published an article about the reception of Vestal virgins in literature and art from late antiquity to the 19th century. So I've also written a book called Borderline Virginities about sacred virgins in late antiquity, but the paper that I get to present today, however, builds on previous work that I've done on Lego and religion. And so, as I said, this is work in progress, but I have recently become very intrigued by the concept of Easter eggs in popular culture. And I was thrilled when I saw that Sarah Iles Johnston mentioned them in her 2018 monograph, The Story of Myth. Popular culture provides a fertile ground for a host of narratives, symbols, and characters from the history of religions. Dispersed and consumed on a multitude of new emergent media platforms, these narratives, symbols, and characters become ingredients in artistic processes of imagination and adaptation, where religion can be played with in a variety of ways. In these processes of production, consumption, and engagement, there are high stakes, but also new room for exploring and combining humor and playfulness with awe and great mystery in ways that resonate with, but also contribute to this contemporary cultural production of religion. And I don't know why this is apparently timed in a way, but I was supposed to move on anyway. But just briefly, cross-banding reboots, Easter eggs, and ever-expanding multiverses lay the ground for new intertextual networks and spectacular truths revealed to the most devoted fans. So my hope now is to look more closely at how these theories about metamodernism can help us grasp some of the complex processes that play out between on the borders between religion, spirituality, and non-religion. But very briefly first, how I entered this field of religion and popular culture at all, because at one point in my life, 8 years ago to be exact, I discovered Lego temples, and I realized that I was literally waiting in research material on my own living room floor. Having written since then about various aspects of Lego's multimedia story worlds, I came across metamodernism when I was invited to contribute to an anthology on the cultural study of Lego, edited by Professors Sharon Mazzarella and Rebecca Hines. And this is also when I started to look at the Lego movie and the second part, the Lego movie 2. I will present some of this material towards the end of my talk, because my current interest in multiverses and Easter eggs grow out of this 2019 publication on the Lego movie. My argument is that Easter eggs provide means for engagement and social bounds that open for larger narratives and perhaps even truths shared by those who see and recognize them. Metamodernism as a description of a cultural trend pertaining to a generation to whom digital, social, and pop cultural media are, it seems, but a natural extension of their sensory system, opens for an ontology and cosmology where there is room for a multitude of superhuman agents and forces. Just to clarify very briefly, some of the theoretical approaches that my argument builds upon. I'm taking so the direct impact of popular culture on contemporary religious ideas and practices is, of course, very difficult to measure. I have relied on the studies of Lynn Schofield Clark and Stig Jarvard in particular, among others, to illustrate what seems this apparent connection between production of popular culture and the cultural production of religion. Yarvad underlines that his term, the Nav religion, by no means referred to a kind of religion that is inferior or unimportant compared to, for instance, institutionalized religion. And this is important. He thinks of religion without this hierarchic idea that we sometimes encounter when people talk about religion. So one of the strengths of this kind of religion that Yarvad writes about is, and I quote, it lies in the ability to create representations that arrest attention, evoke emotions, and support memory. The affective power of narrative, particularly when narrated by multimodal media, is thus an important aspect of this process of production, dissemination, and reproduction of religion. And also Ingrid Gilhus, who I've quoted here, builds on Yarvad in her studies of New Age spirituality as religion everywhere, arguing that, quote, not least because of mediatization and the market, these New Age phenomena are now all over the place. Such as in the line to a ride in Legoland in Denmark, as you can see here, where you encounter a meditating Sensei Wu from Ninjago. So as an example of where these expressions or aspects are to be encountered. This can perhaps equally be said about Marvel, who recently teamed up with Disney in what seems like an unparalleled pop cultural power demonstration. I do not have time to dwell here on the plot lines and twists of these series that came out this spring, but I will only bring your attention to the fact that the protagonists of both these series are well suited to be categorized as what we often call superhuman agents, the god of mischief himself, Loki, and Wanda Maximoff, who is also known as the Scarlet Witch. Marvel has for years now built their almost extravagant cinematic universe, which again works in an intertextual yet independent relationship with the comic books. And I don't have time to go through this analysis, but I noticed that Brendan Graham Dempsey mentioned the same, and I thought about this very same quote that I have from his YouTube videos, but it really resonated with my impression of what is constructed or some of the things that goes on also in these series. So in addition to TV series where new storylines are drawn and characters further developed, emphasizes what Sarah Iles Johnson sees as the importance of episodes in mythological narratives. Quote, audience members continue to think about the stories in between installments, and this is important, she says. This allows for the audience to get to know the characters better and also to engage and invest more in their fates. Such episodic narration, also, Johnson points out, allows for longer and more complex story arches. This is seen with another favorite feature on Marvel that Johnson called crossovers. That is, when character from a familiar, that is, a character who is familiar from one context appears in another, as when Iron Man, for instance, suddenly appears in a Thor movie, or when Bruce Banner and Captain Marvel enters a scene in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. So we are now into the world of hyper serials, endless narratives that intersects and interweaves, and that also allow for the introduction of new characters and plot, which seems to be in the true spirit of capitalism. Dictionary.com, which I think is a fitting reference for working on Easter eggs, defines Easter eggs as hidden messages, as a cryptic reference, iconic message, an inside joke that fans are intended to discover in the television show or movie. It presupposes and plays on common knowledge, most often about characters and previous stories that are leading up to the one in question. Easter eggs originated in video games in the 1980s, but have by now become an almost mandatory feature in any big production. They are jokes and messages that are intentionally hidden, for the audience to spot or actively look for. And I have some examples, but I'll skip them. and a myriad of narrative strands that we saw meeting in endgames. So the hints that are all left now in these series seem to lead up to a new grand finale with the multiverse of madness, where Dr. Strange gets the task to deal with an unhinged multiverse. Again, narratives and characters are weaved together, picked up again, and elaborated in an endless weave of self-referencing, rewarding those who have done their research or who have invested in the larger mythology. Interviewing spiritual seekers in Sedona, Arizona, in her recent book, Susanna Crockford has noted how notions of multiverse were part of the worldviews of many of her interlocutors. According to them, they had access to portals that allowed them to transcend the realms and universes, not unlike Doctor Strange and a number of other Marvel or Lego characters. Crockford notes how the idea of multiple universes, or multiverse, seem to correspond to current scientific interest in quantum physics, not unlike how Big Bang theories correspond to or respond to theological concepts of creation ex nihilo. As Sarah Johnson points out, crossovers may also reward audience with a sense of having special knowledge, which makes them feel complicit with a narrator and thus further encourages them to buy into the narrative, somewhat like the Easter eggs that contemporary viewers spot in movies and television shows. Crossovers, and I still quote Sarah Iles Johnson, crossovers in sum can do a number of things very efficiently. Establish the existential, ethical, and operational rules of a new story, lend it credibility and authority by their mere presence, and establish a particular climate or mood by gesturing towards other stories. So the audience become actively engaged in the story as they are invited to interpret the clues and fill the holes in the narrative. And I also have an example from the Lego movie, but seeing that we are running out of time, and I have already written about this, so I guess I should not dwell too much on this. But again, just to summarize, the point here is this prophecy that introduces the whole narrative, and which is, of course, throughout the movie, something that you can believe in or not. The protagonist, Acad, is this nobody who saved everybody, as the story is supposed to be about. And this is where I find specifically metamodernism to be very interesting and relevant for the interpretation of what goes on in this Lego movie. And as also Linda has noted already, this is the most quoted quotation from Van den Akker and Vermeulen. So I won't go through this either, but just to point out that this prophecy becomes very, what should I say? The truth about the prophecy, or whether it is true, becomes central to what goes on later. And there is a lot of doubt, and there is a lot of believing. And I'll just show you this one scene where this special one, Emmett, is really struggling with this belief. And I'll share this with you. So I know that sounds like a cat poster, but it's true. Although it is easy to hear Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston's "There Can Be Miracles When You Believe" from DreamWorks' Prince of Egypt, this is still a new kind of belief. So combining, I don't know if we can say nostalgia anymore, but there is this new sense of humor, being both tongue-in-cheek and utterly sincere, it seems. The cynical humor of the scene leaves an extra bitter aftertaste because it makes the audience really, really want to believe. The prophecy that started it all, we learn, is indeed made up, like Lord Business cruelly pointed out in the starting scene. But can it become true nevertheless? If you Google the internet, it will let you know, oh, sorry. It will let you know that Emmet supposedly also means the truth. So if you want to believe it, it is up to you. As Crockford describes one of her interlocutors, quote, media provided him with clues through which he constructed his own narrative of individual messianism. It's all about finding and deciphering the Easter eggs, perhaps. Thank you. So I'll stop there and not share my last Loki screen. And that still leaves us a little bit of time for questions, discussion, answers. I do hope that I can find a way to look at all the speakers. If you can let me know if you have a question or comment, you can raise your hand or you can notify me in the notes. I can see the gallery now, so I can see all of you. Okay, first that is Hans Legrand.
Yes, I have a question to Linda Ciriello. You gave a very interesting overview of articles published about metamodernism. I wonder to what extent does your research and your scope also include say holistic authors? So I think that in the holistic realm there's quite some metamodernism getting on. For example, people like Ken Wilber. Would you consider that a metamodern figure as well?
Thank you, Hans. Yeah, here's how I would address that, because you're quite right that there is, to a large degree, if you Google metamodernism, you're going to see metamodernisms out there in the popular landscape that have little to do with some of what the academic projects are. Sometimes they have some overlap into those projects. And with something like Ken Wilber, whom I associate with integral theory, my sense, by loosely tracking what's going on in other arenas, it's all very interesting, but one can only do so much. Is that there is a sort of new generation of what they call themselves, I believe, integrals, and so they have kind of an update of Ken Wilber's integral theory into something that they've refashioned a bit, and there is a faction within that group of people that would like to use the word metamodernism as synonymous with their integral. It's not accepted across the board. Some people don't believe that metamodernism and integral are the same thing. Some are sure that they really are the same thing. So there's quite a lot of discussion about that fact, and I didn't include them in some of these other projects, mostly because I was trying to stick with the, academically sort of, the works that follow the expected sense of verification. And some of the projects I think are, like I say, very interesting. I might even be in favor of what they're supporting as a kind of a prescriptive project. But candidly, I wouldn't say that all of the projects that are out there necessarily have very deep roots, or as you bring up this particular example, they may be recapitulating something that they may or may not have known was already extant. So there's a lot of things to work out in there. Whether they want to claim some aspect of their work as metamodern or not, yeah, it's everybody can do what they want with the term, and at the end of the day. Thank you.
I should also say that Brendan has posted a video with that would follow up on this question. Does anyone else have something? Also, of course, the panelists can post questions or comments.
We have a question in the chat stream. by
Oh,
someone
there.
who might want to give. We could either read it or she could say it, and we could
Yes.
respond to it.
That is true.
I could,
Leora?
yeah, hi, thank you for the presentations. It was extremely interesting. I'm wondering more about the choice of metamodernism, other than using, let's say, hypermodernism, which is more common maybe in French research, or, well, late modernism has gone kind of old in the past 20 years, but hypermodernism I do see in European writing. It's less common in American academia, but would you like to refer to that, or is it relevant at all for you?
I mean, well, the others probably have very different answers because what you're presenting is periodizing terms. But I'll say, from my perspective, I think we need to work to transcend the category of modernity and even modernism. And I'll say this, for example, because paradigmatically, many of the figures who are defined as quintessentially today, quintessentially postmodernists, were in their own day defined as quintessentially modernists. For example, Nietzsche was for a long time the paradigmatic figure of modernism, and then he became recouped as the paradigmatic protogenitor of postmodernism. We could say similar things about James Joyce or what have you. So I think that there's something troubling about this notion of modernism itself, this idea of modernity as period, and even as a kind of aspirational working towards modernity. I think that there's some things that can be useful about the terms like late modernism, but again, it functions synonymously too close to postmodernism. And I think that there's a tension between movements that self-define themselves as modernist versus attempts to do periodization. For my critique of the notion of modernity, I have my second book is basically on a version of that. It's called The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of the Human Sciences. But I think others might have different reasons for their preferred terms. So I'll lean out.
Well, I can pipe in. You may have seen that I put up a slide for a moment, which I had actually planned to bypass for time reasons, and it had other proposed postmodernisms. I don't know if you saw that or not, but I was going to point out that the terms, there was trans postmodernism, performatism, cosmodernism, digimodernism, and altermodernism. And I'm interested in this hypermodernism that's more prevalent in France. I really want to know more about that, so that's on my list to look that up. But these other proposed postmodernisms were being floated between about 2000 and let's see, the last one I have made notice of was cosmodernism in 2011. And there was a really cool kind of spirited debate going on in the American Review of Books. I'm sorry, I think it's called American Book Review, special issue in 2013. The issue was called Metamodernism, but there were lots of voices coming from, like Alan Kirby's digimodernism was represented, this cosmodernism was represented, Eshelman's performatism, and it would take some time to sort of tease out what each one is trying to do that's a little bit different. I guess the people who have taken to metamodernism might say that they like the fact that it functions as an umbrella term for the aesthetic signature that they were trying to get a fix on. Whereas I think some of the other isms might be focusing on the what has come to the fore given specific technological innovations, or they might be focusing on another sort of slender line. But to some of our minds, metamodernism does a better job of encapsulating more of those things. It may just be opinion, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you. I think about, I personally use the term hypermodern in my research about religion, because what I like in hypermodern, and I haven't heard that as much in your presentation, is about the aspect of acceleration of life, the pace of life, the pace of knowledge and transmission, which I did hear in most of your presentations, right? And especially when you talk about the mediatization. So you might want to have a look, there's a few, but again, it's the same struggle, not wanting to use the, deconstructionist, whatever philosophy behind postmodernism. So So this objection to postmodernism is kind of widespread. I wonder if we can all, at some point, get one term to use the whole thing together. It would be nice, no?
Can I throw
I
out a
wonder
thought
if we
too?
can.
Can I just say one thing as presider? We are for now, we are running out of time, but I hear that we are allowed to spend at least 15 minutes longer. So if people here are interested and don't have to run further on to their next session, we'd be happy to stay a little longer so that we can continue this conversation. I'm sure most of the panelists at least will be interested in doing so. So please, Brandon.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say to that point, at least the way I think about this issue too, is that with the emergence of, and again, what languages you want to use for this can shift, with the emergence of a new episteme, with the emergence of a new cultural sensibility, with the emergence of a new cultural paradigm, structure of feeling, what have you, that doesn't necessarily mean that other or earlier or different cultural paradigms just disappear and get entirely subsumed by whatever is most new. So as far as hypermodernism, I would argue that that's sort of a continuation of what we would think of as modernism or modernity, but as you say, sort of an accelerated or hyper form. And so when we're talking about the emergence of new cultural sensibilities, I see it as sort of a stacking on a layer cake. And these other cultural sensibilities can continue to change and morph. But I think if the search is for what is the cultural sensibility, I think it might be kind of too fraught with, because of the complexity of the situation that we're seeing the layering. And one of the ways that I do interpret metamodernism was that shifting between mindsets that this sort of layering kind of necessitates. The necessity of having to sort of navigate between different sensibilities and structures of feeling, and that itself being its own sense of feeling, if that makes sense. That would be my take on that.
I wouldn't mind also trying to pull a couple strands together. Something you said at the end, Leora, and that Sissel was mentioning about crossovers. And a couple other of us were talking around this crossing of existing narratives, crossing of timelines, crossing of characters. And it fits with the current emphasis on visual media as a participatory kind of performance of identity in a way that I work with in my work, because I do find it really fascinating that this contemporary activity of framing our reality through the lens, as if we can process and view moments in our lives like snapshots, like that we're meant to look at moments in our life as like snapshots or scenes in a movie, and that are meant for consumption by our network of followers. It's so commonplace now as to almost not be noteworthy. But it's a specific kind of reflexive propensity that especially the younger generations seem to come by very natively these days. But I feel like it has a lot of it's possibly something very significant for us to think about, because it's blurring the lines between lived and constructed realities. And we've got these transient realities and identities that are really meant to only exist in a momentary manner, or to be taken as partly true. We were talking about just because it's not real doesn't mean I don't feel it. It's like we can see that especially young people are fostering forms of community with fandoms and online, role playing that don't insist on adherence to a single truth or a single totalizing reality, but they thrive on these multiple perspectives, even when it's very clear that it's not real. And when they do so, what I speculate about is that the effective message is that you don't have to find your one metaphysical truth, and you don't have to be alone, because you're sharing a portion of your truth, a portion of your identity, a small snapshot, very widely. So we can want and to believe and want to know that something's true, but also find that it's acceptable if it's provisional.
Oh, I see. There's Brandon got his hand up first. Okay.
It was actually to ask you a question, Jason. So you're welcome to go if you want.
Well, no, ask me first. I was going to just, add to Linda and think a little bit about tensions between periodizing versus pattern recognition, and what you do when the pattern that you're observing, for example, fandoms, famously the fandom subculture, for example, starts after Star Trek. And its attempt to revive it as original series. So we're talking peak period that many people will call post-modernity, or it's just a question, or many of the features that some people have been flagging, combinations of irony and sincerity, arguably trace. We can find quite early hits of that pattern. So the question, I think that there's a tension between thinking about what is occurrent and what are the features that we're really interested in, and which of those is more important to the kind of theory that you're all doing when you're shaping your notions of metamodernism or metamodernity. I'm going to throw that out there, but Brendan, you had a question for me, and I'd be happy to answer that instead of taking us on this tangent. So please do.
No, it's a good one. I mean, we can go there instead, but because I have thoughts on that too, and the interest, noting the patterns and the question of periodization and whether or not when the question for me of cultural dominance is some kind of phrase that gets thrown in here for the fact that Duchamp did something, in the early 20th century that we might call postmodern. Well, do we distinguish that as being something different because it was, anyway, different conversation. But I had a quick question for you, Jason, which was in reading your book, and as you've talked a little bit about today, you sort of problematized the very notion of, say, postmodernity or postmodernism and modernism. And sort of show how these terms have been so loosely used and the problematic ways that we kind of use these ideas. And yet you are also using those ideas in order to situate your work. And so I was just kind of wondering, because you do, it seems to me, also then kind of come up with a sort of working sense of what this term is supposed to mean, even as you're deconstructing and problematizing it. And I was just kind of wondering if you could speak to how these things can be balanced and how we can, how that works.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, so in the first instance, what I'm against is notions of grand periodization. So, when you, and again, this is probably where I'm out of sync with some of the rest of you on here, but I don't think that there are evenly distributed grand zeitgeists. William Gibson said, the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed. I think zeitgeists tend to be very hard to define and pin down. I think Foucault's grande episteme don't actually, he has some evidence for them, but only in localized regions of parts of Europe, and the transition between them is messy and only captures a certain group of the French elite, for example, at a particular moment, or French and Western European elite at a particular moment. But what I'm interested in is, I don't think that the terms are useless. I think you can, for example, talk about if you're willing to specify it within a certain domain. So if you want to talk about, for example, postmodernism in architecture, and then you're very specific about which architectural forms you're talking about as postmodern architectural ones, and that those forms are clustered for a specific reason, maybe because, let's say, they're self-consciously postmodern architects and they're all reacting to Yanks or whatever, and they're trying to take on a specific project, or even if they're not self-consciously clustered, if there's a secondary reason that those are clustered, then you could use that as long as you've come up with a reason that they're clustered. In my case, more specifically, I'm interested in postmodernism as an intellectual paradigm that became diffused within the Anglophone Academy, particularly in a kind of pizza effect via France in basically the 80s and 90s. And the properties that I'm interested in were drawn together in compilations that referred to themselves as postmodern and postmodern theory and postmodernism, and then taught to many of us in graduate schools in a particular period. So I'm happy to I use this in the book a little places, but happy to call it postmodernism 1 or postmodernism 2 or whatever, to recognize when we're talking past each other. So again, I don't want you to, as a group, to think that I'm in any way hostile toward using metamodernism to do some clustering together of phenomena that you're interested in and that which you see significant similarities. Terms are free flowing and we can use things in any way we want to. I'm just cautious about notions of grand period, that, the idea that we were all postmodern, for example, like, the Lyotard argues for the death of narrative, for example, as the central defining feature of postmodernism. And at a moment when new grand narratives were proliferating, what he's really talking about is simultaneously some late iteration of the death of God, but people have been riffing on that since the 1850s, and or since at the very least since Hegel and then Nietzsche, and the fall of and so. And a de-emphasis on perhaps Hegel himself, but it's not very, in the same moment he's describing the death of grand narratives, millions of other grand narratives are proliferating. So it didn't work very well as a pattern. It just, it was a very trendy work, and he captured something interesting about anxieties of a current moment. But it didn't, it's the same critique that Cornel West makes, or that Moyo Khadiji makes, about the way that whole groups of people and their experiences drop out when we try and create this broad gestural categories. So, as Cornel West puts it, and Cornel West uses the term postmodernism to talk about certain philosophical forms, but he's very reticent to use it to talk about art or pop culture, because he, notes that the Black experience is excluded in those kinds of arguments and discussions. So for those reasons, again, I'm trying to, balance a little bit here. I'm not, I'm just, things that I think it takes a high bar to capture a grand episteme. And I think also, the other issue is we have to be really careful, I think, when we're talking about metamodernism as distinct from postmodernism and modernism, we have to specify. We often presume that the other person shares our usage of the term postmodern or postmodernism or even modernism. And if we don't do a little bit of extra specifying work, I think we're bound to talk past each other. And part of that is, for example, a lack of historicity in the theorists of postmodernism themselves. So, the idea that irony is a unique phenomena that developed only at a late period in thought, or the idea that many of the people who were supposed to be like trumpeting reason, this back projection of an enlightenment that Pinker and company are celebrating, many of the defining Enlightenment figures were themselves critical of reason and its limits. I mean, that's why Kant calls his book The Critique of Pure Reason, right? So, I mean, again, we have to be careful not to back project a caricature that we're contrasting ourselves from. And I think we can do better work when we restrict our field of conversation a little bit. And so we're talking about, I'm talking about, the way that contemporary art is riffing off of this other preceding movement or what have you. So that's all. But thank you. That was a really great question and points at some significant stuff.
So my timer is moving quickly towards the quarter till, and I am afraid that our session will be cut at that time. At least that's my understanding. So thank you all to everyone for joining us, and especially to all the presenters who have put forth a lot to think about for the time to come also. And again, we are very, very grateful to have this very first AAR panel, but we definitely hope it will not be the last one, I assume. So we're very excited to see how this work on metamodernism will proceed. So thank you again all for joining us, and we wish you a great AAR in the days to come as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.